Alrighty. I'm going to Italy.
Welcome to Smithsonian Journeys, Venice. My name is Ken Bartlett, and I'm Professor of History and Renaissance Studies at the University of Toronto. I've been teaching Italian history for almost 40 years, and this is my favorite city. I'm standing in front of a squero, which is a boatyard for the construction and maintenance of gondolas. Now, gondolas are one of the symbols of the city, but they began as extremely efficient means of transportation. They're very, very shallow and very narrow because many of the canals in Venice are very shallow and very narrow. And it was necessary to provide access to those canals and the people who lived on them. Also, the gondola is not straight. It's slightly curved because the gondolier rows from one side and the boat must be propelled forward. The gondolier places his or her, because there are now some female gondoliers, or in that almost sculptural object known as a forcular or oarlock, and that allows him or her to propel the boat forward. Now, the decoration of the gondola hasn't really changed very much at all. The basic shape we see was determined as early as the 13th century. And in the 16th century, the decision was by the Venetian government that there could be no decoration of the gondola. The gondolas all had to be black. However, foreigners were permitted to decorate their gondolas. It's human nature to want to pimp your ride. So the result was that the Venetian state knew where those wealthy and influential foreigners like ambassadors were. You simply followed the decorated gondolas. The only decoration that was permitted is that elegant stern, and on the prow, that comb-like structure, which really has 6 teeth. And those 6 teeth really constitute the symbols of the 6 sestieri of the city. Now, the last person to own a gondola and employ a private gondolier was Peggy Guggenheim, and she died in 1979. Motorboats, after all, are far more efficient than gondolas. However, Umberto is waiting for us. Let's get on the gondola and see Venice as it was meant to be seen, by water, by boat, by gondola. We're approaching a small bridge, the Ponte dei Pugni, the Bridge of the Fists. It's called that because it was the site of the equivalent of the Venetian Fight Club. Between 1600 and 1705, groups of working class youth, the Nicolotti and Castellani, would gather on this bridge and they would fight. The purpose was to try and push one another off the bridge into the cold water of the late fall and early winter canal. All of this was fine until in 1705, knives were taken out and roof tiles were thrown, resulting in too much danger for the population. So the Venetian government decided it was probably more prudent to stop it. So the last fight took place in 1705. We're approaching one of the most infamous bridges of Venice, the Ponte delle Tette, the Bridge of the Breasts. It takes its name from the fact that this was the red light district of the city, and the women who were plying their trade would gather on the bridge and expose themselves to the waist, not only to attract customers, but with the encouragement of the state, trying to convert men of homosexual tendencies. Also, prostitution wasn't illegal in Venice. In fact, it was almost encouraged. There were more than 11,000 registered prostitutes, and the special tax they paid made a great contribution to the coffers of the Venetian Republic. Here, on one of the busiest canals of Venice, is traditionally the house of Marco Polo. In 1274, Marco Polo, then a teenager, was taken to the east by his uncle and father, and there he spent 24 years at the court of Kublai Khan. So he became such a loyal and trusted advisor, and so useful that the Khan didn't want to let him go. But eventually, he returned to Venice in 1295, and he returned a very rich man, having brought gems in order to finance his future business. He was so wealthy, he equipped a galley in the war against Genoa, and in 1298 was captured by the Genoese. He spent 2 years in a prison cell with Rustichello da Pisa, a teller of romantic tales. Rustichello wrote down these stories from Marco Polo in French, and eventually he published them as a book, The Travels of Marco Polo, or more popularly known as Il Milione. Either a million lies or a million wonders, depending on whether you believe the stories. And it became one of the best sellers of the Middle Ages. We're approaching the beautiful Bridge of Sighs. The bridge links the Ducal Palace with its law courts on my left, together with the prisons on my right, the first purpose-built prisons in Europe. This lovely 17th century bridge was called the Bridge of Sighs by Lord Byron, who imagined that those who had just been condemned walking across that bridge and looking through those beautiful traceried windows and sighing at their last vision of freedom. The most famous of all of the prisoners who walked across that bridge was Giacomo Casanova in the 18th century. He also was the only prisoner ever to escape from the leads. Here we are back at the Square. I hope you've enjoyed our little tour through the canals of Venice, seeing the city as it's meant to be seen. It's now time to say farewell and sincere thanks to Umberto, our gondolier. Umberto will have to bring his gondola, which can last up to 70 years, into the Square for maintenance. Every 40 days, it has to be taken in to be resealed, and once a year, taken in for an entire month to be stripped down to the wood and completely repainted. But that month gives Umberto an opportunity to take a holiday himself, usually in the winter, because after all, we've had our vacation, and I think it's only fair that Umberto has his.
Hello?
I'm on Murano, an island 10 minutes by boat from Venice. From 1291, all of the glass-making factories had to move to this island because the heat from the furnaces burned down the city so often. Also, the glassmaking was such an important part of the Venetian economy that glassmakers were given an enormous number of privileges. However, if they ever took their skills elsewhere, they were hunted down by the paid assassins of the Republic and they were killed.
Coke machine?
Bravo, Maestro Imperio, meraviglioso. I'm standing in front of the great gates of the Venetian arsenal, the Arsenale. The gates date from 1460, and the lions on either side were taken by the Venetians from various sites in Greece, mostly in the 17th century. But from 1104, there has been right here the place where the Venetian navy was constructed. The arsenalotti, those who worked here, on a virtual conveyor belt system, the most sophisticated until the Industrial Revolution, could produce a great war galley in just a single day. It was because of this site and the skill of the men who worked here that Venice ruled the seas. The mask has a long history in Venetian society. The tradition actually begins with carnival. Carnival by the 18th century lasted for months, beginning just after Christmas and ending only with Shrove Tuesday in the beginning of Lent. And during that time, the expectation was that one wore a bauta. A bauta is a simple white mask that was surmounted by a three-cornered hat, and the body was covered with a cloak called a tabaro. And when wearing this costume, you were essentially anonymous. That meant that even in some voting procedures, no one knew who you were or for whom you were voting. But there were other kinds of masks as well. For example, there was the servetto muta, that is the silent servant. Silent because very large eyes, but no mouth hole. And in fact, the mask is held in place with a button held between the teeth. That meant, like any wise servant, you could see, but you couldn't tell anyone what you'd seen. And then finally, there's the zany. The zany comes from the Venetian dialect word for John, and we get our word zany from it, in fact. The Zani was the stupid character in Commedia dell'arte. Very long nose, very, very steep forehead. And in fact, the longer the nose, the steeper the forehead, the stupider the character. So what we see in Venetian masks is that they reflect not just an element of decoration, not just an element of carnival, but in fact, Venetian society itself. Venice reaped the riches of the sea through its naval galleys, through its merchant fleets, and through its fishing boats. And if you want to see the wealth of that bounty, come here in the morning. Nowadays, most people arrive in Venice by road or by rail, but we are going to approach it the way it was meant to be approached, through the Bacino di San Marco, the Basin of St. Mark. And we're going to begin in the Piazzetta, between those two great granite columns of St. Mark and St. Theodore that have welcomed visitors to the city for centuries. Are we ready? Let's go. Behind me are the columns of St. Mark and St. Theodore that announce the entrance to the Piazzetta and Piazza San Marco. Now, these columns aren't Venetian at all. They were taken by the Venetians in order to decorate the space. In fact, the Venetians had a tendency to take other people's property in order to do that. But on top of them are the patron saints of Venice. If we look on the right, we can see the first, St. Theodore. Now, St. Theodore was a relatively undistinguished saint from Asia Minor, who, like St. George, killed a dragon. The Venetians didn't have a dragon available, but they did have a crocodile, and so the saint is actually dispatching a crocodile. And if we look on the other side, we've got the column of St. Mark. Now, St. Mark's symbol is a winged lion. And on top, there's what looks like a winged lion, but really isn't. It's Persian. It's a chimera from the Temple of Sandon. But it's close enough, and the Venetians thought it would do. In between those columns, there was a place of public execution. Now, if you were of noble birth, you were beheaded. And if you weren't, you were hanged. Had the same effect, concentrated the mind. If there was no public execution in progress, it was used for gaming. Games of chance took place between those two columns, and there must have been a connection between that and public execution, and I'll leave it to you to determine what it was. Now, if we look here, this is the great mass of the Palazzo Ducale. This was not only the home of the Doges of Venice, but also the central offices of the Venetian Republic. Before the palace was built, this was an orchard, and in Old Venetian dialect, orchard is broglio. And so that space on the first arcade is known as the Broglio. And so there, when Venetian patricians were lining up in order to enter the Palazzo Ducale, they in fact could engage in politicking to determine who would vote for whom on what case. So that's where we get our word imbroglio, or embroiled. Look here, you can see a very thick column, and above it a cluster of three, surmounted by a figure of justice. That is where the palace ended in 1355. And the reason it ended there is that the architect, Filippo Calendario, got involved in a conspiracy by the Doge, Marine Falier, to overthrow the Republic and establish himself as king. Well, they were found out and they were both beheaded. And the result was that it stopped there because an architect with no head couldn't really finish his work. So it was only in the 15th century that in fact the palace was continued towards the Basilica of St. Mark. Now let's walk along that extension in order to see the grand ceremonial entrance, the Foscari Arch, or Porta della Carta. I'm walking out of the Foscari Arch, named after that Doge we see here, worshipping the winged lion of St. Mark. It's one of the most wonderful examples of Venetian Gothic 15th century architecture anywhere in the city. It's also called the Porta della Carta, the paper gate, which has nothing to do with its means of construction, but everything to do with the Venetian government. After a law was passed and proclaimed, it was then pasted onto this gate so that all citizens were aware of the law. Ignorance, after all, is no excuse. Next to it, we can see the four tetrarchs, those four porphyry figures of Roman emperors taken from the Philadelphion in Constantinople. The Venetians like to take spolia in order to represent their victory over others. And in this case, in the Fourth Crusade in 1204, they took a great number of things to make sure that this was going to be the grandest square in all of Europe. And as we walk towards the two columns, known as the columns of Acre, they actually have very little, in fact, nothing to do with Acre whatsoever. They too are spoils from Constantinople, taken in 1204 from the Church of San Polyeuctus. And they were set up here in order to celebrate this Basilica of St. Mark, the private chapel of the Doges, which will be our next stop. I'm standing in front of the magnificent Basilica of San Marco. This wasn't the cathedral in Venice. In fact, it wasn't a cathedral until the 1830s. It was a private chapel of the Doges. In other words, it represents that union of spiritual and political power that was the Venetian Republic. This is the third church on the site. The first was built about the year 830 in order to receive the body of the evangelist Mark, which Venetian merchants stole in Alexandria and brought back to the city. This church dates from about the year 1000 and is modeled on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. You can still see the Byzantine quality. You can see on the ground floor in particular, the decoration that is so Byzantine in its elegance and in its wonderful symmetry. But then, if you look above the north door, you can see what the church looked like in the 1200s. Throughout the entire period of the Republic, this church was decorated. In fact, is almost a compendium of the artistic and architectural history of Venice. You can see not only the Romanesque decoration, but the pointed Gothic arches, the decorated finials, and of course, the mosaics. Despite the existence of that 13th century mosaics, most of the others date from the 18th century, because mosaics tend not to last in this damp world. But the most important thing probably constitute the spolia here as well. The Venetians do have a tendency to take other people's property to decorate their own. And besides the columns on the ground floor, there are the four horses, the quadriga. They were taken in the Fourth Crusade in 1204 from Constantinople, from the Hippodrome, where Constantine himself had them established at his new capital, now Istanbul. They were brought here in order to indicate the authority of Venice over almost everybody else. And so they've stood, although these are copies because the originals were brought inside. Napoleon stole them, but they were returned in 1815. This is Venice, and it's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, and it constitutes our image of what really Venetian culture and society was like. I'm sitting in the most elegant drawing room in Europe, as described by Napoleon, the Piazza San Marco. It's surrounded not only by historic buildings, but also by historic cafes. I'm sitting in Quadri, and across is Florian, which was opened in 1720, making it the oldest cafe in Italy. And behind me is Ravenna from 1750. The piazza, though, is dominated by these wonderful buildings on either side, describing a rectangle around the piazza. These are the procuracies of St. Mark, Procuracy Nuovo and Vecchio. That is the old and the new procuracies. They were the offices of the procurators of St. Mark, an extremely important position in the Venetian Republic, keepers really of the gold reserves of Venice, because they kept the treasury of the basilica. They also took responsibility for patricians' wills and other things. It was such an important job that they were appointed, like the Doge, for life. But the structure that dominates the square is this. This is the bell tower Campanile of St. Mark. It was begun in 902, and in 1902, exactly 1,000 years after, it collapsed. Fortunately, it was rebuilt precisely the way it was, up into, in fact, that wonderful gilded angel, which by tradition caught the light and guided those Venetian merchants coming from the east back home into the basin. At the far end is the Napoleonic loggia. That Ala Napoleonica used to be the site of a church, the Church of San Gimignano. However, Napoleon, when he declared himself King of Italy, as well as Emperor of France, felt that he needed a palace in Venice. Palazzo Ducale, the Doge's palace, was inappropriate. It was uncomfortable, and the last Doge took all of the furniture with him. So Napoleon decided to pull down the church and to build that grand structure, which consists of staterooms and ballrooms, and today is the entrance of the Correr Museum. Napoleon never actually lived there. This square then represents the most beautiful space in Venice, but let's leave it in order to discover some of the other treasures of this wonderful city. This is the Rialto. I'm standing in front of the church of San Giacomo di Rialto, and it was here in the commercial heart of Venice that the city actually arose. By tradition, there was a church on this site from the 5th century. But what we see is a Byzantine church of the 12th century, and it was under that portico that Shakespeare's merchants, Antonio and Bassanio, would gather to determine those rich argosies on the flood and where they would be going. There is a clock to make sure the meeting was on time, and there was a bell to ensure that everybody knew that a meeting was going to happen. But there's another element here that makes this an extremely important place and that also reinforces that connection between politics and commerce that was the mercantile Republic of Venice. If we look here, we see the Gobbo di Rialto. Now, Gobbo in Italian means hunchback, and it's almost certainly from this figure that Shakespeare found the name of his clown in Merchant of Venice, Lancelot Gobbo. Every law, every decree of the Venetian state had to be made twice. It had to be proclaimed in Piazza San Marco on the Piazza del Bando, and it had to be proclaimed here simultaneously in the commercial heart of the city. But there is something of a sinister element as well. Those merchants who were unable to meet their obligations or who went bankrupt had to run virtually naked from the Piazza San Marco here to the Gobbo, and the population would line the streets and strike them with switches. It concentrated the mind and ensured that very few Venetian merchants didn't pay their bills. This jewel box of a church is Santa Maria dei Miracoli, built between 1481 and 1489 by Pietro Lombardo, and recently preserved by the American Save Venice Fund. It takes its name from a miracle working image of the Virgin that's located inside, an image so powerful it managed to raise from the dead a boy who was at the bottom of the Giudecca Canal for over an hour. It's also a very popular place for Venetian weddings. It's small, and the bride can arrive by gondola. I'm standing in front of the church of San Giovanni e Paolo, or as the Venetians call it, San Gianicolo. This large Dominican church is the second on the site, having been built in 1443. The story of how the Dominicans came here, though, is an interesting one. In 1267, the Dominicans wanted a site for a large preaching church. They went to the Doge, and the Doge said, well, the city is crowded, I'll have to think about it. But then that night he had a dream, and white doves descended and landed on an open space in Venice. And the Doges assumed that the white doves represented the white robes of the Dominicans. And so he gave that place to the order, and the first church on this site was built. But he also knew Dominicans were brilliant at engineering and that they would drain the swampy site and add to the glory and size of Venice. So everyone benefited, and 25 Doges are buried in this church, including that first Doge whose tomb is right on the facade. This fine fellow mounted on his horse is Bartolomeo Colleoni, a famous condottieri or mercenary captain who fought for Venice. He became immensely wealthy and very powerful, and he was also extremely vain. So he wrote a will in which he said he'd leave this immense fortune to the Republic of Venice on condition that a statue to him be raised in the piazza. Well, when he died in 1475, the Venetians had a problem. They wanted the money, but they didn't raise a statue to anyone in the Piazza San Marco. This was sacred space. But they found a way around it by putting the statue here in Campo San Giovanni e Paolo, because in any other part of Italy, this Campo would be a piazza, and it's in front of not the Basilica of St. Mark, but the Scuola of St. Mark. So on a technicality, they accepted the money and they put the statue in its place. Also, they honored Colleoni by commissioning the greatest sculptor of the latter part of the 15th century, Andrea Verrocchio, the teacher of Leonardo da Vinci, to build the statue. And he came to Venice, and he not only put this marvelous piece of sculpture in place, but also he was an engineer, and he was able to distribute the immense weight of the horse and rider on just 3 legs, the first time since antiquity. This is one of the most beautiful buildings in Venice, the Scuola Grande di San Marco. A scuola isn't a school, but a lay confraternity, like a service club. And this was dedicated to helping the poor, as we can see San Marco assisting the poor citizens on the tympanum above the door. This building was built in the 1480s after a terrible fire destroyed the original 13th century structure. And two of the greatest architects and sculptors of 15th century Venice were involved. The ground floor, Pietro Lombardo; the second floor and above, Mauro Coducci. The use of the decoration to have that almost sculptural sense of distance and perspective, the symbolism of the Lions of St. Mark, and that marvelous union of sculpture and architecture has created a truly marvelous vision. After the suppression of the confraternities by Napoleon, the building was first empty, and then in 1819, after Venice was given to the Austrians, it became the Austrian Military Hospital. But it seemed to have worked because to this day, this is the Hospital of Venice. One of the most beautiful buildings in all of Europe is the facade of a functioning civic hospital.